Hi. So I'm Mary Minow, but I'm not speaking on behalf of IMLS. I'm also with LibraryLaw.com, and I'm the attorney for the Khalifa Group, a consortium of California libraries that has set up our own Adobe content server. So I'm speaking on that behalf. So we were asked earlier, what was the library, museum, archives' key business? And my work is mostly with public libraries. And people need to be able to borrow books, and people need to be able to borrow eBooks. So do we need libraries to make that happen? I mean, really think about it. How many of you are borrowing directly from Amazon or Oyster or Scribd? It's really, yeah, come on. It's very easy. It's a very seamless experience. So in some respects, I would say that libraries are the worst way to borrow eBooks, except for all the others, to paraphrase Winston Churchill. Because when we talk about our core values of what libraries represent, that's when things start shifting, and you might think, well, maybe libraries are the only place, or the worst place, but better than all the others. John Palfrey has a new book hot off the press called Bibliothèque. Is he here? Okay. I highly recommend it. It's Why Libraries Matter More Than Ever in the Age of Google. And it's eloquent. He says, if we do not have libraries, if we lose the notion of free access to most information, the world of the haves and have-nots will grow further and further apart. So let's take a look at the library core values and how they translate in the print world and the ebook world. In the print world, you go to the library and you borrow a book. Pretty easy. And I didn't know till I went to library school that what's happening behind the scenes is the libraries are working with vendors, multiple vendors. They're working sometimes directly with publishers. They're getting the books on the shelves that they bought maybe 30 years ago. And they have a circulation system. And the libraries own the books and they own the shelves. Okay. The ebook world. You could take the easy way and pay some fees and join Oyster or Scribd. And you could instead choose to click through a lot and go with what's available through the libraries. But you're paying, if you're going with the pay-per-play version, then you're paying a monthly fee. You're paying again and again for each book that isn't available because not all of the big five are there. It's really not the best of all worlds, but the worst of all things, it's part of their business model, is that they're tracking everything you read, all right? And they're making that available to the publishers. When you click on the library, you're taking your chances, and behind the scenes, the librarians are, for the most part, renting, right? They're renting the content, they're renting the bookshelves, and they've got a circ system that they didn't design. And both, after a year, if they choose to switch vendors, both the books and the shelves can disappear, right? So the core library values, which are equity of access, anyone can borrow, including people with print disabilities, preservation, and in this context, in public libraries, I'm talking about last year's books, okay? You know, are those still there? And privacy, the freedom to read. After 9/11, just take one story, a 10-year-old boy of Middle Eastern descent came into the library and wanted to borrow a book on airplanes, and his father said, you better not do that. So privacy is so essential to our freedom to read, because if people are watching what we're reading, then we watch what we read. So can we build those values into a library-based ebook ecosystem? Equity of access, we've got the, okay, hold up your drinking glasses, openlibrary.org, which is for, I didn't say Brewster, which anyone can borrow a book. And in fact, you've got privacy is completely secure because you scrub the IP addresses. You're the only ones I know that really do that. You've got disability access up the wazoo because you go up to the current books. But what the Open Library doesn't have is that big plethora of the current books for everybody else. And so we still have gaps in terms of being able to buy things, being able to own things, which is essential for having control over the privacy, for having control of making things available for disability access if they're not already. And we certainly don't have it for the pay-per-play. So I am an attorney for Khalifa, which is a consortium of the California libraries, and we have over 75 of our members have joined the Enki platform, which is for eBooks. So we have our own server and loan out the books. We have a shared collection, but we've just starting to roll out the complexity of allowing each library to buy their own books with their own tax money for their own users. And that's a huge need. And what the biggest need is to have that marketplace so that we can make the books available to them so they can seamlessly buy. And we don't have that. And that's something that doesn't make sense to create on each individual level, and nor does the hosting make sense on each library's jurisdiction. That's something where I could see pooling our resources and making a shared hosting available and making a shared marketplace available, especially the negotiating with the publishers. So that's what I see as our gaps, and John Palfrey says it's up to the libraries to shape rather than merely react to the forces around us. I'd like to turn it over to Micah. You've been tracking the numbers. What can you tell us about eBooks, library users, and consumers?
Thanks, Mary. So first, I just want to say quickly, just to thank you to IMLS for inviting me to speak to this distinguished group. I feel a little outclassed, but I'll do my best. I have been thinking a lot about eBooks, especially in the last 6 months, and longer, the last 3 or 4 years, but deeply. And so a couple of facts that to me are interesting. The first is about the size of the market. So I think this has really been an important dynamic in our positively evolving relationship with publishers, which is that while consumer ebooks have largely plateaued in terms of direct consumer sales, library ebook spend is growing very quickly. So in 2009, it was about 30 million. In 2013, which is the most recent available IMLS data, it was 111 million. So that's a compounded annual growth rate of 35%. Now that can't continue, but even at half that growth rate, by 2020, we're looking at well over $250 million that libraries will be spending on ebooks out of a $1.2 billion total public library acquisitions budget. So there's a lot of money libraries are already putting into ebooks, and it's growing very quickly. Second, it's worth noting that libraries generally cannot keep up with demand. So even with those fast-growing collection budgets, we can't maintain the same holds queues on E that we do on P. At New York Public Library, we shoot for no worse than a 5-to-1 holds queue, and in E, we can't come even close to supporting that financially. Third, that circulation, it's worth noting that even with this exploding growth, library ebook use lags really far behind commercial ebook consumption as compared to print book consumption. So we all saw Amazon's news 2 Christmases ago when they sold more ebooks than print books. That's already very old news, and because there's a slightly thinner margin on ebooks, ebooks make up about 28% of trade publishing revenues. In libraries, we circulate about 7% of our circulations in ebooks. So there's a huge gap between where consumer demand would appear to be based on the market and where use in libraries is. So even with the rapid growth curve, there's tremendous need and opportunity for our ebook purchasing to expand. Next, it's worth noting that this is a very small market with one very dominant player. It's fairly obvious. Overdrive sells to 91% of libraries in the United States. There are a couple of new entrants that have already made a good go and are, I think, in the black, Baker & Taylor and 3M being the most prominent. But we're mostly all using the same vendor products to serve ebooks to our users. And finally, I think it's fair to say that NYPL and other libraries are not completely satisfied with those products. So while they have served us well in many ways, they got us started in this business when we didn't know how to get started. They brought many publishers to the table. There's a lot of good that's been done by having these vendor solutions. I believe that it's time for us to look beyond that and think about libraries taking a broader role in really owning our library user experience around ebooks. So those are some of the facts that I think are interesting.
Well, then what do you think libraries should do to step up our game?
So, at the most fundamental level, I think it's time for libraries to own their relationships with users around ebooks. I think that we've accepted a model where our service of this important format type is done entirely through third parties, and the result is that we don't control the interfaces in which they interact. Those are often much more commercial than the interfaces we would deploy in our own environments. It means we often don't hold the user accounts where they are putting their private information and where they will return for their next transaction. It means we can't control the privacy. We can't work on that issue ourselves. So I think we need to own those user relationships. Anyone who's building a business in the private sector would start there. That's kind of table stakes, right? You don't give someone else your consumer relationships. And I think as libraries, we have the ability, the potential to have deeper relationships. We're more trusted, and we have many services to offer beyond ebooks. And we can't draw those connections and build that relationship unless we own it on a technological level first. Second, I think we do need to reduce the cost and the ROI. So at NYPL, at least, the return on investment in our ebook collection has fallen. So even as we've increased the budget that we spend, we get fewer circs per dollar. That's not a sustainable environment, and that's not an environment that we want to see in our fastest growing content area. So I think we need to work on that. And part of that is about price per se, which I'll talk more about later. I think part of it is just about having inventory management control. So right now, we don't have the ability to set important controls on things like automatic checkout and loan periods. We can't optimize holds queues. So if I place 15 holds today, they could all come up at the same time. They could come up when I'm out of town. There's no work being done to optimize our inventory. I think we could come close to doubling the real circulation we get out of our collections if we owned that and dealt with it as an inventory optimization problem. Next, I think that we need a single sophisticated point of contact with publishers. So I had the wonderful experience in 2012 of joining Tony Marks, NYPL president, in approaching Big Five publishers at the time it was Big Six, and 4 of the Big Six were not selling ebooks to libraries at all. So many different parties worked on trying to cajole them into the market, including ALA, but also including NYPL, and since then have maintained relationships with those publishers. And one thing that I see as a big problem is the lack of a central point of contact. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean one person that interacts with every publishers, but between each publisher and the library industry, I think there needs to be an empowered and sophisticated point of contact. So this could be distributed amongst libraries. It could be that I walk up the street and talk to folks at Simon & Schuster, while the Khalifa, someone from Khalifa, manages publishing that's local to California. But between us, we should be having one clear conversation. Publishers are still fairly small businesses, even the biggest of them. They are scared of interacting with 9,000 different libraries or even with 50 different state consortia. They need for us to come together and present them with a counterparty that they can interact with in a new way. And I think if we could do that, there's tremendous progress to be made easily with better licensing arrangements with those publishers. They're very open, actually, to experimenting. I think they largely know their initial crack at licensing wasn't perfect. But right now, we don't have that advocate and that point of contact. And frankly, incentives are not aligned for vendors to be that person. And so I guess finally, I think we need to really explore different models for how we approach this. And I think to solve this problem holistically, there are many win-wins to be had, and there are roles for a lot of different kind of players, especially in such a fast expanding space. If we don't step up, I think we risk just being kind of a pass-through provider of a service, and that's not what we want to be in the future. But if we can step up, I think we also have opportunities to explore different kinds of relationships with private companies who often play a very important role in this space, and there's a very important role for them to play, but it may require us thinking a little bit outside of the traditional vendor-customer box.
So if I heard you right, you would negotiate with the New York publishers, and we could negotiate with some California publishers and share that marketplace, as it were, and so that I could buy from the New York publishers and you could buy from the California publishers. That's what we need. That's what you're talking about?
That's what I think we need. That's what I think we need. I think that it's time to fill this gap in our national digital platform. I think we're ready. So, some things about this vision. So first of all, I think the proofs of concept have been done. They've been running for a while. Khalifa is a great example. I like other examples like NC Live in North Carolina, which was very focused on local content and has a great collection. And then there are projects that are about to go live, like the Amigos Network in Texas and the Evoke project in Colorado. But these things just scream for scale. Once you go to the trouble of interacting with a publisher and onboarding their content, you want to bring that to the whole country. There's almost no variable cost in doing that. So it needs scale. But I think these existing platforms have proven that libraries can handle the technology. We should not be intimidated by it. It's been done. It's been done in very small budgets, and we can easily aggregate a budget that's more than enough to build the technology. I think what we need to do is come together around a business model, a governance model, and a coalition that can really put this to work. So some things about that vision. First of all, I think we can build this in the near term. So within a couple of years, 2 years, I think we could potentially have this stood up and working. I don't think this is a 5-year project or a 10-year project. I think it could start with ebooks, but I think it could very quickly expand to include a lot of other media types: music, audio, periodicals, comic books, et cetera, et cetera. Fundamentally, the model is not format dependent. I think we could follow and advance some principles that have already been laid out and have really resonated. So one example of that is Readers First, which is a small sort of library user group that has been pushing pretty hard in a very focused way around interoperability between ebook distributors. And I think we could really advance those principles by sort of getting in the game directly and providing an alternative. I think this could quickly become self-sustaining. So if you think about the growth in the market that I described, with already well over $100 million being spent, and by 2020, easily $250 million will be spent by libraries. It doesn't take very much of that in savings to sustain this effort. So it doesn't have to be a cost center. It doesn't have to require grant funding on a long-term basis. All we need is a startup investment, and I think this can become self-sustaining. I think it can also potentially spin off funding to support other important leadership work. So it could become a model for that. I think some elements need to be centralized. So, I know that's a little bit of a dirty word in this room, but I think the idea that we empower someone to go and sign one license with a publisher and then anyone can fall in and use those same terms, I think we need to empower a few staff to do that. So there needs to be some elements that be centralized. At the same time, I think many elements of this work could be decentralized. And I think it could offer some really compelling new kinds of library work to library workers of the future. So a few examples of that. There's no reason that there has to be one person that interacts with every publisher. As I articulated already, I think interested and capable libraries or other institutions, including private companies from across the country, could approach publishers or other creators and owners of content like authors and onboard their content using standard licensing agreements to a national platform where any library could buy it. They could then get a small percentage of that sale or in some other way be compensated for that work, because it is work and they should be made whole. That should be sustainable. So it doesn't have to be that we deputize one negotiator that works with every publisher. We could decentralize that as long as we coordinate it and we put it all in one place. Hosting and the technology doesn't have to be centralized. In fact, it shouldn't be. We should have one common platform in the sense of running the same technology, but we should have many nodes in a distributed content hosting environment so you get it from your local nodes so that there's redundancy, et cetera. That's sort of a simple best practice, I think. And then, I think that there are other elements in terms of curation that could be decentralized. So, if acquisition staff choose a bundle of books that works well for their library, the system should be able to share that information with other staff and other libraries so that they can draw from that. And so that could feed things like recommendations to patrons, and it could also be creating shared carts or collections that other libraries can buy in the same way. So I think there are roles for a wide range of libraries.
So let me break in there. Let's say you've negotiated a license with a publisher out in New York, and I think I can do better with that same publisher. I don't want to use that license. Can I still do that in your vision?
I mean, sure, I guess. I think, so I've had this conversation with at least all of the big 5 publishers, and I think one thing that that they want is a couple things they want. My belief is that they need some level of central point of contact. If you could go back to a publisher and get a better deal, then maybe you call me before you approach them and we coordinate that in some way. I don't think there's that many people out there beating on publishers' doors trying to negotiate on behalf of libraries, so it should be possible to coordinate those efforts. I also think they need access to a broad marketplace. So, in New York, we could not put up a Douglas County model or a Khalifa model and work with the publishers that are right down the street because they're frankly not open to selling to a fragmented marketplace. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem in this. I think we need to come together and put up a national offering in order to entice all of the content into that marketplace. Once we've got that marketplace working, I think we can be very flexible about who we empower to go and improve the deals that we get. I just want to underscore one thing there vis-a-vis publishers, which is that I really believe there are deep and meaningful win-wins here. So part of that win-win is that any improvement we can make in terms of the margin that libraries pay and therefore returning some credit to libraries will immediately be reinvested in content. So that can drive further growth for publishers selling to libraries, which is one of their fastest growing areas in this field. So they are excited, I think, about selling more to libraries, and this could help with more of that. I think the other thing that we can do is think about our shared goals of just instilling a love of reading in every person, and promoting books in broader discovery of a wider range of authors and a wider range of titles. So I think having this kind of sophisticated representative where at least someone speaking more or less on behalf of the library community has a real personal relationship with someone in the publisher will start those kind of conversations that could lead to a lot of follow-on benefit.
Okay. And so what would be your vision for the next steps and a call to action?
Yeah, so I think, I think if we could do this, there's a lot we could do. I mean, maybe I can say before that a little bit about what I think the impact could be.
Okay.
So users, would be able to borrow books directly from their libraries with library values, which I think is, the key and the overarching point. I think we could allow libraries through that to build stronger relationships with users. We could also save a lot of money if you just sort of back out a small percentage of that large market. And I think by improving ROI, have a similar magnifying effect. With those strong relationships with publishers, we open new frontiers, and I think it potentially fosters a collaborative paradigm and some new kinds of institutional structures with libraries that could create a jumping off point for other shared projects like shared OPACs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's important. In terms of a call for action, I think, as Maura said this morning, we're building on, at least in this field, at least a decade of experimentation and some live work. So NYPL in 2012 wrote a grant called Library Simplified, and through the IMLS's funding, this summer we're going to be releasing an open source e-reader. That is just one piece of this puzzle. It's the piece that most touches users. Any library will be able to take that and deploy it for free. We're going to try our best to help you set that up if you need help. And we've just submitted another proposal, which if funded, will commit NYPL to building a lot of this stack, a lot of what we need. So we won't be 100% there, but I'm going to say we're going to be 70 to 80% there. So we have we've already committed to doing a lot of the work that needs to be done to build this piece of the National Digital Platform. So what we need is help. And I think there's a lot of little and big ways that can happen. I think one, so we just had an amazing conversation at DPLA Fest about this, identified the pieces of this stack, who was working on them, and kicked off some working groups to dig into this deeper. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested to follow that effort and get involved in those working groups and find out how specifically you can contribute. Second, I think, otherwise you can contact me, contact anyone who's working on this, and lend a hand. I think you can join and participate in the groups that are deeply working on this. So Readers First is a good example. It could use a lot more help to sort of articulate interoperable standards across the industry. I think you could deploy Library Simplified, so start using open source technology. I love the point earlier that investing in open source technology is investing in your staff as opposed to spending your budget with a vendor. And I think even if it's sometimes a hard road or a scary road, beginning to do that is helping this cause because you'll surface problems and you'll improve them. I think deploying Library Simplified is an example of how you can chip in by using it. And then I think you can also help. Some of you have resources available, and so joining us to sponsor a small part of the build will help. I mean, that's going to be part of getting to the full solution. And then finally, I think committing to using this platform if and when it's built will make all of us investing in it more confident in that investment. So that could be in the form of some kind of pledge to buy from it. We can talk more about that. But I think getting to the point where we know there is appetite to start working in this way will make those of us who have taken this small piece of the digital platform and trying to charge ahead on it real. And that's all things libraries can do. I think if you're not in a library, you may be able to provide financial support. Many of you are funders. I think you can encourage libraries to get involved with this effort and to work in this way. And I think you can share your ideas, and we need those too. Let me stop
Thank you.
there.
Any questions? Yes, Jim.
Jim Neal, Columbia. I thank Micah for laying out a very exciting and energizing approach that I think works very well for public libraries. I think it's important to bring into the conversation as well the experience and interest of the academic library community, which are complementary but very different. We've come off of a major revolution in, if you will, e-journals, and we gained a lot of experience and knowledge, and we made a lot of mistakes in terms of how we embrace that. But the purpose and nature of use of ebooks in the academy very often focuses on course-related materials, use in classes, increasingly on the ability to search across a database of e-content to do significant text mining. The publishers we work with are very often academic publishers, small and independent publishers, and we're trying to wrestle through the larger issues of self-publishing and how that enters our space. Increasingly focused on how we bring research data and other complementary and supplementary materials into the e-reader experience. And the whole, which we've talked about a lot today, is we have no strategy for long-term preservation of e-books in this country. And we've got to wrestle through that issue in some substantive way.
And we need to have ownership of some files. I mean, I'm not against
agree.
licensing, but we need to have one copy that we own.
I agree with that.
Right, so thank you, Jim, for that excellent point. I mean, just a couple little things to follow on that. I think that's right. I will confess that I have been primarily focused on this from a public library perspective. I do think there's tremendous opportunity for synergy between academic and public libraries in this space. I need to learn more about exactly what the use cases are. And in fact, one of the DPLA Fest working groups that we agreed to kick off would focus specifically on library use cases. And originally it was suggested that it be about academic use cases, and then we decided, look, it's about all different kinds of use cases. So I think that is the next frontier for this work. We are developing a vision that I think can work for public libraries, and I think that's enough to sort of potentially get this off the ground. And I think the next step is to feel out how it needs to be adjusted, what are the requirements for academic libraries, and how can they contribute. I think there's a lot of the same problems. And I would just say one example of that, my experience, often what we buy, NYPL being a unique institution that has both sides of this in-house, we are not asking for the same kinds of things from our vendors, and it's because we haven't had a use for it. But just as one specific example, around interoperability and the importance of those lines that connect the pictures on the architectural diagram, which I agree, those are in many ways the key. If we just started in academic libraries asking our vendors to provide APIs to the content so that at a minimum we could make the bibliographic information discoverable, if not the entire file, that would allow us the piping to start thinking about serving that content through the same kinds of interfaces. So I think we'll want to be careful about the user experience and making sure that it serves the specific use case we're targeting, but I think there's tremendous potential there.
Just to follow up, Jim, on your comment about e-journals, I'm Rachel Frick, the Director of Business Development at the Digital Public Library of America. So we did have a 2-day meeting about eBooks in Indianapolis 2 weeks ago. We'll be posting follow-up notes and activities and commitments, hopefully by the end of this week. I'll be working on that tonight, so follow up for that. And one of the comments that came up out of that working group was a lot of ex-serials librarians, and I count myself as part of that, having flashbacks to negotiating these big licenses for e-resource content. And we said, how do we move those lessons forward to inform these conversations around ebooks? So one of the action items out of the 2-day meeting was to bring together our folks that have that expertise and talk about transparency about licensing terms, best practices in licensing for e-resources, and have a work group that really moves that expertise and those lessons learned into this ebook conversation. So just kind of wanted to do a public announcement on that.
I just want to add a fact about the journal market. And Micah, just to put it into context with the ebook, I'm looking at a STM report. This is a publisher report that says that in 2008, the STM, English language STM journal market brought in $8 billion. In 2013, it brought in $10 billion, so it's now 2013, 2014, 2015, and that 55% of that revenue, this now, $13 billion or whatever it is, I'm not going to do the arithmetic, comes from the United States. So this is the amount of money that we are spending to rent access to content.
So first of all, I guess it would be obvious if I thanked Micah and his colleague for the great conversation today. Mary and Micah, thank you. And I do think, having worked in an academic library and now in a public library, that eBooks is actually one of those opportunities to look at how we create interoperability, which is a very broad term in this case, between different kinds of content. So we often think of things that it's a manuscript, it's an archive, it's an e-journal, it's a, you know, it's a monograph. Actually, this is an opportunity where people actually use a format, which is an ebook, in chapters, in whole, with all kinds of marvelous opportunities with the nature of how reading may occur in the next few years. And I think this is an opportunity for us to figure out how we put those things together. We, as the New York Public Library, have a great chance to actually, because we have such a breadth of and diversity of users in our community. We have independent scholars, we have kids who are learning to read, we have families who don't even speak English, and they're all interested in ebooks. And so I think this is an opportunity to partner much broader than our own walls, because we all share this need in common. So I just think this is a great fertile ground for collaboration between different kinds of institutions.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next. Well, time's up. No, well, we just got the time's up, so I just trying to gracefully get out. Thank you all.